Hello. Welcome to everyone for coming tonight in person and to those on live stream. My name is Mary Lanners and I'm chair of the Justice Council here at Pax Christi. This is our first Justice Speaker event in person since COVID started 2.5 years ago. We are very excited to welcome Louise Matson, Executive Director of Indian Works. In June of this year, the Justice Council created a land acknowledgement team, working along with our Care for Creation ministry to go deeper and deeper into learning the history of the American Indian, whose home was right here where our Pax Christi community now exists. Our goal is to acknowledge the past and to build relationships within the American Indian community right here in Minnesota. When Peg Musicades and I heard Louise Matson speak this summer, we knew we wanted to bring her to the community of Pax Christi to share her important experience and perspective with us. I'm particularly excited to hear Louise again today, and I am so grateful that Louise accepted our invitation.
Hi there, I'm Peg Musicades, and I'd like to just take a few minutes to introduce Louise to you. Louise Matson is a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, and she graduated from St. Olaf College with a BA, and later received a teaching license from Concordia Colleges for grades 1 through 6. She founded and operated the first Boys and Girls Club located in the school in Minneapolis before being hired at the Division of Indian Works in 2002. She directed the Youth Leadership Development Program before being hired as the Executive Director in November of 2014. Louise served as a mentor for Big Brother, Big Sisters for over 10 years. Louise was a founding board member of the Bedote Learning Center, which is a Dakota and Ojibwe immersion school located in South Minneapolis. And she is a co-chair of the Phillips Indian Educators Group and vice chair of the Metropolitan Urban Indian Directors. I'm so excited to be able to share Louise with you all tonight. She has a powerful story. And Louise, I hope you can share that story and teach us some things that we can do to be of use for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So Buju, Louise Matson, Indigenous, Makwa and Dudam, Gawa Pa, Bakinikag, and Dunjaba. My name is Louise Matson, and I'm Bear Clan from the White Earth Nation. I'm also an urban Indian through and through, born and raised and lived in South Minneapolis my whole life. And I'm pretty representative of the Native people that I work with, and Native people you'll see. I'm multiracial. My mom is Norwegian and Icelandic, and my father's enrolled at White Earth, and that's something you see a lot in the urban areas, and we're going to talk about that later. So just so you know your perspective, I'm going to do the best that I can, sharing my knowledge with you. I have 20 years of experience at DIW, and I love working and being part of my community. So tonight we're going to open with a smudge, and I'll explain what that is. And you are welcome to participate, and if you don't want to, you can just pass it along. It's not going to hurt anyone's feelings. If you're in community where that happens, that's totally fine. Nobody's going to be unhappy with that. And in fact, a lot of times women don't participate when they're on their moon, when they have their period, because we believe that women are very powerful during that time, and we can alter ceremonies. So it's not about being unclean, but about being very powerful, and people will stay away from ceremonial, women will, during that time. So we'll pass it around. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but we'll do smudge. Then I'm going to do some language, just to talk about terminology, because it's confusing to a lot of people. And then we're going to talk about Native people in Minnesota, just some basics. We could spend forever on this topic, but just so we know who the Native people are in Minnesota. And then talk about urban Native people. It's very distinct, and I don't think a lot of people realize that 70 to 80% of Native people live off reservation. And Minneapolis is a prime example of that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll talk about my agency, Division of Indian Work. We're actually celebrating 70 years of existence this year. So yay, I can't believe it. Yeah, 70 years. So I'm gonna get the smudge. So what it is, it's sage. So it's one of our medicines. So it's a medicine for the Anishinaabe and Dakota people here. And we burn it. We use it for other things, but in this case, we're gonna burn it, and it has a smoke, and that's a purifying smoke. So people will put it over their head, around their body. You'll see some people do their entire, from head to foot. We'll often smudge a room or an entire building, and you could smell it a lot, and that you'll recognize that smell, and you'll know what that is. It's people practicing their medicine. So I'd like to share that, especially with non-Native people, because it's so common. If you walk into my building, you're gonna smell that, because we start off a lot of meetings that way. People will use it in schools if there's, like we wanna settle kids having a hard time, let's smudge. Also, it is smoky, so if that does irritate you, if you want to step out again, it's not going to hurt my feelings, because I understand some people might have some allergies. So I'm going to light it, and then I'll bring it around, and you can smudge, or you can say no thanks, or no, and that's fine. I was carrying around my matches. And so this one thing that we're harvesting this time of year, people are going out and picking it and drying it, so we have it all year. So also our medicines here are sweetgrass, sage, and cedar, and tobacco. So I'll talk just a little bit about that, but when we pass this around, my elders had taught me that it's a contemplative, quiet time. So sometimes when we have a meeting and we start, I'm always like, shush now. Like, people need to listen. So, and you can just simply put it over your body if you want. So start here. Yeah, you could do that. Great, I'm glad we had the time to do that. I didn't know if we would, because takes as long as it takes, right? You know, I was listening to our teacher, or reading actually, a man named Anton Truer who wrote about Indian time, because you hear this saying, people go, oh, it's Indian time, it's Indian time, it's people will be late or not watch the clock, and his premise in talking to elders is that is not true. Like, we would never be, our elders would have never been so rude as to have people waiting for us, and if we did that, we wouldn't be able to harvest, we wouldn't be able to get things done. And he said what that really means is when we have a ceremony, we go until it's done. That's Indian time. He has an elder he said that's what that really means. And I really agree with him in a lot of ways on that one. So I'll talk a little bit more about him, but we can put that first slide up then with the language terms. So I always kind of start off talking about American Indian, Native American, and Indigenous, because we all know that Columbus got it wrong. We're not, we're not Indians, and that the correct term, we've been told, say Native American. But here you have me, I'm from Division of Indian Work, and I do a lot of work with Minneapolis Indian education, and it's used all the time. And in fact, when I'm talking, you're going to hear me switch back and forth all the time. I do it all the time, and a lot of people do. And mainly, American Indian is just used, it's a government term, it's a federal term, it's in our constitutions. The federal government had a hand in almost all our constitutions, especially here in Minnesota. And so that term it's used in contracts, in formal documents, and so it's been kind of taken on and taken on by the community as our own. Like, we still will use Indian a lot. However, as we have language revitalization and people understanding what happened in history, more people use Indigenous. And you really can't go wrong saying a tribal member, right? So I introduced myself as a White Earth member, but like I said, I've never lived there, and I'm never gonna live there probably. But that's a way of placing myself and finding relatives, and that's happened to me at meetings where it's like, oh, it's like a small town, like, oh, who's your family? And then you find out who you're related to. So I was at a field trip once with a young kid. We were at the old Metropolitan, or we were doing, and someone said, where are you from? And he said, Boys Fort. Well, that's way up north. And I could just see this reporter going, wow, that's a field trip. Wow, yeah. But really, he went to school in South Minneapolis. He lived in South Minneapolis. So you can't go wrong with Native American, and you really can't go wrong if you ask the person, what's your tribe? Where are you from? And they'll tell you. That's the best thing you can do. But a lot of the younger generation, they use Indigenous. So that's why you hear American Indian. And tribal or constitutional change is hard, so it's not really a priority for the tribes to try to change that language. But people are using more and more of our language terms for ourselves. That's kind of, as we have language revitalization. We didn't in this country have freedom of religion for American Indian people until 1978. That was not that long ago. So a lot of our practices, our language, our culture, we either lost it or it went underground. So now that we are seeing things like Bedote, the immersion school, and people are understanding what happened and are understanding language terms, that's becoming more common. So if we go to the next slide. So I put this one up. Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Sioux. You want me to go more in the middle? So this is referring to the same group of people. So we are on Dakota homeland. This is the birthplace of the Dakota people. And I think that your church, you've done a lot of work already in understanding this. And then they also are in the same family with Lakota people, and there's even Nakota people. They're commonly referred to or have been referred to as Sioux. Now, a lot of teachings that I've heard around the term Sioux is that it's a pejorative. It's what Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people called them, short for a snake. And some of you may have heard that. So but it's still used. You know, the Shakopee Midwakitan Sioux tribe, they're still using it, and I would never, ever, you know, no one should tell a tribal nation how they should refer. If they want to refer themselves as Sioux, they will, but you hear that less and less, and you hear people say Dakota, because that is their name in their language, is Dakota, or Lakota. So similar with the next slide, which is my people. So Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and Chippewa. When you hear those three terms, that's referring to the same group of people. So Chippewa is a mispronunciation of Ojibwe, and in the language it would be Anishinaabe. But see, a lot of these languages were not written down, and we are an oral language, so people came in and they heard it wrong and they wrote it down. And as you can, I'm sure you know, many different spellings of all three of those things, of all three of those words. Chippewa is hardly ever used anymore, but there is, you'll still see, you know, you'll still see that. There's a Minnesota Chippewa tribal coalition of all the different tribes, and they still use Chippewa. And then Ojibwe is more common, but Anishinaabe means the people, and that's what we call ourselves in our language. That's my tribal language, of which I don't have much, but I have enough to know that, to introduce myself in protocol. So that's just to clarify that. When we talk about Indian people here in Minnesota, we can go to the next slide then. And I can talk fast, so just stop me if you have questions. And it's hard to see on this map a little bit, but if you look at those green spots, those are the Anishinaabe reservations in Minnesota. There's 7. They're all in northern Minnesota, because the Anishinaabe people, we came here from the east, we migrated through Canada, came through northern Minnesota for several reasons, but one of them was the prophecy, the plant that grows on the water. Does anybody know what that is? Wild rice, Monoman, it's sacred. That's why you see a lot of Native people on the forefront of fighting against sulfides and mining, because that's going to impact that wild rice. It's very sensitive, and that's a sacred plant for us. And so you can see those big groups of folks, and there's a whole bunch of us all around in Canada. They're called First Nations, and all in the same kind of language family, Algonquin, that we might be different tribes, but we can understand each other because people stopped along the way. Then we came through northern Minnesota. So the largest group of Native people in Minnesota are the Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe. And my reservation is the biggest one up there, the big green square. That's White Earth. So you'll find a lot of White Earth folks here in Minnesota, a lot of White Earth people. So we're by far the largest group. And so you can see how they're scattered around there. If we had more time, we'd spend like a whole morning, a whole day even. We divide groups by each reservation, have people go to the tribal websites, learn about the tribe, and report back. So we came through, and I referenced that term Sioux. I mean, there was conflict. And in fact, I mentioned that my dad, well, I haven't lived on my reservation. My dad really hasn't either. He grew up in a small town, Warroad. I don't know if any of you know, right up on the Canadian border, right by Roseau, which is where my mom is from. And Warroad is named Warroad because of conflict. And then the smaller 3 or 4 red dots on the rivers down in northern part of Minnesota, those are the Dakota communities. So Lower Sioux, Upper Sioux, Prairie Island, and Shakopee. So we have those 4. They're a much smaller part of the population of Minnesota, and a big part because of the War of 1862. So in 1862, again, we could spend a whole course on that, but there was a 6-week war between Dakota people and settlers, very brutal on both sides. But as a result, more brutal for the Native people, lost, were forced marched to Fort Snelling, where they spent the winter there. And then we also have Mankato, which is the site of the largest mass hanging ever in the United States, where they hung 38 Dakota men. And then in 1863, they passed the Dakota Removal Act. So those that survived were moved out of Minnesota. And it's still a law in the books, still stands, the Dakota Removal Act. So it's not even legal for Dakota people to be here in their own homeland. And so, it's one of those things they bring up every so often, like we should get rid of this law. But I think it'll happen someday soon. But so they're smaller, they're coming back. They're reclaiming their land and their language. So that's good to see. So there's a lot more Dakota people that just outside of Minnesota, Montana, South Dakota. So any questions? I know we'll have questions at the end, but. So we have those 11 reservations or communities. The Anishinaabe, the Chippewas are the Ojibways, they're called reservations, and the Dakota people have communities. And I think that's just a designation because of what happened in 1862. The communities have different recognition. So we got all that going on in Minnesota. But in the urban area, we're completely diverse. I mean, we have 160 some different nations represented when we count. So one of the many policies that to try to solve the Indian problem was to relocate Indian people to urban areas. And that happened in 1952, starting in the 50s. And that's why my agency was started in 1952, because Indian people were like pledged you would have jobs and opportunity if you left the reservation and went to Minneapolis, to Chicago, to Los Angeles, big cities, and go there. And it's really a land grab, to be honest. To trying to terminate tribes, people onto urban areas. So, but to this day, people still come here for school. They come here to work, and they stay here. I mean, our reservations that people are so proud of, they're beautiful. They're really isolated, and they're often very poor. There's not a lot of opportunity there. Again, a lot like small towns. I don't know how some people survive still living in a small town. It's like that in a reservation. Housing's hard. So a lot of people come here and stay. So at my agency, I have Meskwakis from Iowa, Senecas from New York, people that are even, they're tribally mixed. I had a woman working for me who was a Dakota Lao woman from the Lower Sioux community. So we're very diverse, and that's the beauty of Minneapolis, but it's also a challenge, because we're not all, pan-Indians, or we don't have the same language, we don't have the same practices, we don't agree on everything. And so how do you do, a language program when, a lot of people might not be of that, like at DIW, we have youth groups, and we'll do an Anishinaabe. Let's teach Anishinaabe, and I've had people say, well, I'm not Anishinaabe. I'll say, well, we all learned English. We all learned to trade together. People in Minnesota learned French, so we should learn how to communicate. So that is one thing to note, and it is, as I've seen it, as high as 80% of Native people are living off reservations in urban areas. So I think often when you hear people talking about tribes and tribal nations, they're missing out. They're missing out of a huge group of people. And I've even seen that sometimes with funders over the years that have said, like, well, Louise, you should apply for this grant, but you have to have a tribal partner. And then I push back and say, what tribe? What tribal partner do you want? And not all the tribes have an urban office in Minneapolis. A lot do, but not all of them. And so that's kind of a challenge. I'm trying to educate people. Also in Minneapolis, we have a housing development. It's a Section 8 housing development called Little Earth of United Tribes. It's one of the largest, it's one of the oldest housing development, Section 8 in the country. But people think it's a reservation, and it's not. I mean, some of the kids will joke around and say, I'm from Little Earth, or people will joke. But I had a funder once tell me that I should partner with Little Earth because that's a tribe in Minneapolis. And I said, no, it's a housing development. And I should know. I would know. I live here. I'm from here. But so that's draws a lot of people as well from all over to live in Little Earth. Minneapolis has a really proud history of innovative and wonderful programs for Native people. So that American Indian OIC was started here. We're the birthplace of the American Indian movement back in the 70s. We have a Dakota and Ojibwe immersion now in South Minneapolis. So to my knowledge, it's the only school that's doing 2 indigenous languages. They're 2 very different languages, something that didn't really know how hard that would be. It's hard enough to try to do immersion when you have people coming in like nurses and folks like that might not have the language, but then when you have 2 very different languages. But it's important because as a founding member, we knew that most of our students would be Anishinaabe students, but we're on Dakota homeland, and we are not going to exclude. And Dakota language is far more endangered than Anishinaabe. There are far less first language speakers. There are a lot of people that are language learners, though, so that's a great thing. But there are not as many people that grew up speaking a lot of indigenous languages as their first language. English is kind of the language of the land. And, that's not unusual. I mean, I think when immigrants came here, when they still come here, it's like learn English, leave your culture, become American. That's how you succeed. That's how you get ahead. And that's what every language, my husband's father's Norwegian, and his parents spoke it, but not to him. They spoke about him in Norwegian, so he couldn't understand. But and I'm sure that happens pretty common. But for Native people, it was literally beaten out of our relatives, and people were punished severely for speaking language and I say, solve the Indian problem. There's a quote for one of our first boarding schools ever in America. That was Carlisle, and it was Colonel Pratt. These are Army folks that started these schools. And his motto was, kill the Indian, save the man. So, it didn't work, and it caused a lot of damage to us as people that we are working to recover from. And so for me, it's important for me to come out. I want to talk about there's need and what happened to Native people, but I don't want people to have pity or feel sorry for Native people and think, like our kids are less than. Our kids should be held to high standards. They're smart. But there's a reason we have the disparities that we do, and a lot of work that we have to do to eliminate those disparities. So that's what I do at DIW. I'm part of that group. And we believe that language, culture, which you can't really separate, that's the key. That's the key. And you can see that shown by like the Hawaiians, the Native Hawaiian people. When they do immersion, they graduate 100% of their kids. 80% of them go on. I mean, they're so successful. It's the model. That's the model we used here in Minnesota because, we want to replicate that success. We graduate Native kids the worst in the whole country here in Minnesota. And that's a problem. And that's my problem too. I'm an educator, like what we have to do better for our kids. And we've been doing better. There's a lot of initiatives in Indian country, and COVID's hit us hard though. So we have to we took 2 steps forward, 3 steps forward, now a step back. So we're busy. We got to get busy. So DIW, where I work, has 4 main programs. So one of our programs is our food shelf, and that's under our health services. And that's why we started in 1952, to 70 years ago, because people were hungry coming in the city and didn't have resources. And so we still have a food shelf. We'll always have people that need a food shelf. And that's just what we do as good people, is we feed people that need to be fed. So that food shelf is still operating and operated all through COVID. We just opened up the garage doors and brought the food out. So that was difficult. And I have to hand it to the staff that when some of us could stay home, they went into work and they made sure people had food. So we have that. We have a teen pregnancy prevention curriculum we developed. It's kind of like a sex ed curriculum. We have women of traditional birthing that works with pregnant and parenting moms, and it does a combination of like modern, like baby yoga. And then they'll bring in an elder let's make a moss bag, let's talk about birth practices when you go to the hospital. Can you keep the placenta? Like depending on their tribal nation. And then we have doulas. We have a huge doula program because doulas improve birth outcomes for everybody, Native people and non-Native people. So we've trained about 30 indigenous doulas and Spanish-speaking doulas. So they aren't a doctor, so they don't catch the baby, so to speak, but they operate like you have your auntie or your mom in the room with you. And they make a difference. So that's exciting to me that we have that doula program. And it's very popular. And we also do indigenous breastfeeding work to encourage breastfeeding, to just improve birth outcomes and improve the health of our babies. So that's our health services area. We work with our seniors, and we have a new program that I'm really excited about, grandparents raising grandchildren. Because that's happening all over the country, especially as we're struggling with opioids, because every community is struggling with opioids. And we're seeing a lot of grandparents that are stepping in and taking care of their grandkids when their own children can't. And it's mostly because of opioids. So I'm excited about that, because it's giving the grandparents some resources and some help when they step in and do that. Then the third program area we have is called Healing Spirit, and that is primarily working with foster care youth. So we have a home for boys by Roosevelt High School. It's for 14 to 21-year-olds, so American Indian boys who tend to bounce all over in the foster care system. So we're going to keep them, like short of a major crime, we're going to keep them. Like trying to give them a place where they can be raised by some, and it's Native men that we staff at 24/7 and connect them with their culture. And then just give them support like teenagers need, but that's challenging. Teenagers are challenging, as you all know, I'm sure, but especially these young men have been through a lot. And then we have another program. Now it's called Stay in Community. Before it was called YLC, and that works with young adults that have been in foster care, and it helps them, and again, helping them like a family would. Because it's not common for people to just walk out the door when you're 18 and you don't call mom and dad for help or get some assistance, actually for a long time. So we help people get apartments, help them get their driver's license, help them get into school, help them with all those things that if they had a family that they could count on, they would do that. So we step into that role. And then we also help them with their leadership skills. And it's amazing, like one of our youth is at Augsburg now. So I'm going to hire him when he graduates. Yay, he already said that, I'm coming to work to DIW. I said, great, Donovan. So he's really motivated. I mean, he's an amazing young guy, but he's been on his own since, I don't know, he's 12, So gotta hand it to him. I really respect these young people. And then the final program we have, that's the one close to my heart, because I'm a teacher by training, is the Youth Leadership Development the Youth Leadership Development Program. So we do out-of-school time work. And so as a lot of you know, Tina, McAllister sends kids to come and tutor with the youth, help them with their homework. It's after school time. So in the evenings, like right now, they're meeting when school's in session. And then in the summer, we have a program called Indigenous Scholars Program that focuses on literacy and reading. And so all of our programs are free. We don't charge anything. We provide transportation, we provide meals. The only requirement is really that you participate with positive attitude, especially for the kids. Like you can come forever, come to summer program, come all year, but just come and then come with a positive attitude. So we probably served, last year, close to 8,000 people. And that's a lot higher than we usually do, but that was because of COVID. And we've had CARES money, and now we have ARPA money for our food shelf. So we're just buying food like crazy, and giving it out like crazy. And I'm a little worried about what's going to happen in June when that ARPA money's done. I didn't really expect to get ARPA money this time around, but everyone's getting a lot of, and we're getting cultural food that's more expensive. Like I can give wild rice that I can't usually give out, and bison, buying all this cultural food and getting it out to people. Did you have a question? The Youth Leadership Development Program? Oh, ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act, COVID money. COVID money. That's been a lifesaver for us, when COVID hit. I mean, like everybody here, like, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do? We're a social service agency, like we're direct services, we do groups. So like everybody else, we went remote, we did Zoom, just is not ideal. But people had to still staff the foster care home. They had to be there. Food shelf had to be there. There's a lot of people that had to be there. And then we got a PPP, a payroll protection program, so I didn't have to lay anybody off because groups got a lot smaller. So once they lifted stay home and it was stay safe, we all went back to work. But we followed the recommendations. So no more than 10 people in a group, including the adults. So if we had a group of 26 kids, now we're down to 8 kids and 2 adults. But that being said, people were also afraid, and for Native people, we're highly vaccinated. Really, I have to hand it to like the health board and whoever partnering together, the messaging has been really good because Native people have a huge hesitation, fearing we're being experimented on because of what's happened in the past. But we've gotten out and we're vaccinated. However, we have really high death rates still because of comorbidity issues. We have diabetes, we have heart issues, we have high rates of, we're not in good health. And so we've had a lot of loss in community. And also our families live intergenerationally. So parents are like, yes, I could send John, he's pretty healthy, but if he gets exposed, he's gonna come home and make grandma sick. And that happened. So we saw a lot of people, being hesitant, and they should be. And we had really, like 2 years ago, a lot of struggle with COVID. Like we'd have our youth group, and then someone would get sick, and we shut down for 2 weeks. And then this summer, we didn't have to shut down at all. So I see it getting better, thank goodness. So there's nothing that replaces being in community with other people. There's nothing. And we have a tool, we can Zoom, we can live stream, and that's great too, but there's nothing that replaces that. And so and I know that everybody here it's been a hard 2.5 years. So we're rebuilding, getting the groups back up. I mentioned we finally have a babysitter again because we always offer daycare. So when mom comes to group, her woman of traditional birthing group, she can put baby in daycare and learn in her class. So we haven't done that for 2.5 years. It wasn't safe. And now it's safe, and so hopefully we'll get more people coming to groups, so it's like a domino impact. So a lot of work to do, though. We know that Native people, everybody, our life expectancy has gone down as a country, but Native people last 6 years. So, and that's related to our health challenges. But to the point that I don't want people to think, oh, all gloom and doom. There's a lot happening around food and Indigenous Food Network and eating healthy. Native people did not have diabetes until like the 50s or the 60s. And that's because we started eating commodity food, which is all processed food. So we're eating commodity cheese, peanut butter, starches, rice, all these things. And, then we saw diabetes, then we saw all those health problems. And I see that happening more in general in the population as we are choosing to eat more of those foods as a people. We are seeing more obesity, we're seeing all those health problems. And so there's a real movement, and I think it's exciting going on in a lot of Native communities to bring back cooking with the traditional foods, if we can afford it. We took, I got rid of the vending machine at DIW, and all the Native agencies did. We got rid of our pop machines. We would never, ever serve pop in DIW. And I got a lot of pushback from that because people are saying I shouldn't tell people what to drink, and I'm not, but I don't have to serve it. I'm not gonna serve it. I'm not gonna take your pop if you come in with your pop. But, so, And there's it's an indigenous food network in Minneapolis that's really tied, you might have heard, it's tied to Dream of Wild Health out in Hugo. They have a grant and they pay for me to have a chef, a nutritionist, a young native guy who cooks at DIW. And so he's cooking healthy food and he doesn't use anything processed. The challenge has been people sometimes don't like it. Like kale, because it's always been that way with the kids. If, when we feed them, it's like they would like pizza and hot Cheetos every night, and that's not gonna happen. But where our taste buds have changed, and so we have to learn how to eat differently. So we do like cooking demonstrations and recipes, and here's how you can cook with this so it's better for you. Also, we have partners that help us grow food. There's a lot of urban gardens. We have to be careful though because the ground is polluted in South Minneapolis with lead and arsenic. So a lot of people do garden beds or grow outside at, different out of Minneapolis. So, a lot of will do gardens and hand out like the kale, which might sit there. But if we teach people how to cook with it so it tastes good, then they will use it. So it's kind of fun actually, and introducing the kids to different kinds of meats that maybe they've never tried before. We actually, Derek someone gave him some bear meat, and that's my chef, and he made a bear stew. And so he's emailing everybody at DAW, I made bear stew. Well, there's a whole bunch of people like me, like I'm Bear Clan. So I'm like, I'm not gonna eat that. I'm not coming down there. So that's why I said you have to have that balance, like we're really diverse people, like that's your clan, you're not gonna eat that, And nobody, I think, got offended, but he was, and he's such a funny guy, and this is like what gives me hope for our people, and is just, when I interviewed him, and he graduated from U of M Morris, and he's a Red Cliff, so he's a Wisconsin Anishinaabe guy. And he's very kind of quiet. So I interviewed him, and he was great. I'm like, oh, Derek's great. He's already done recipes. And then he didn't have any questions for me at the time, but then he called me back. And he said, Louise, what do you feel about foraging? And I'm like, well, I don't do it, but if you want to do it. So he's out there foraging, So he's getting the wild plants. I'm like, just as long as it's not sprayed with pesticides. But he's getting it in a safe way, but he's always out there foraging. And people are doing it actually all over. You'd be amazed, it's a thing. And he was a referral from Sean Sherman, which I know everybody's heard of him, and he's the sous chef. And he's, raising up all these young chefs to come and cook. So there are, amazingly, a lot of indigenous caterers around town that you can hire to come in and do your food. And that's a business. So that's, I think, exciting news and great. Yeah.
I just had a comment. I worked on his book. He did a book for the University of Minnesota Press a couple of years ago on native. Did a whole book on his recipes and everything. He had rabbit in there.
Okay.
So very, I believe I saw him at Michael Center last year. He was working on another book. So.
Oh, was this Sean Sherman?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, he's amazing. And, his restaurant, Awamni, is really like, you can't get in there. It takes like months to get into Awamni. James Beard, yeah. And he's an excellent speaker. And then he also, right across from DAW, so we're on Lake Street between 10th and 11th, and we're kitty corner from the Global Market, which that's the old Sears. I remember going there as a kid. And they're opening up an indigenous food lab there. So they've been cooking there. They've been cooking there a lot, because even during pandemic, we were cooking and bringing it to the elders. Like, we're not cooking for groups because we're not having groups. So we're gonna, again, try to keep the person employed, try to keep people fed. We can bring the food. So I'm looking every day when I go over there, or I don't go over there every day, but when I'm over there, I look and what's it gonna be? It's like a storefront. I'm like, what are they gonna sell? And they just honored him at the Global Market and his business partner, for their achievement. So, but it really is. There's a lot of. I can name you probably like 5 or 6 chefs that cook. So that's a good thing, because those foods are, they're better for everybody, and then we can reverse some of these unhealthy bad habits. Like, we all love fry bread. had fry bread? Who doesn't love fried bread? Anything. It's good, but it's so unhealthy for you. So people don't serve it as much, but then you get pushback because people love to have it. But so it's all about changing habits. And, you know, I think I brought the circle here because I want to encourage people to, as you feel safe and comfortable, I have a couple, I'll leave them here. And you could probably get them, I don't know if they deliver out here, you might have to go into the city to get them. But this is our native paper, the circle, and it's been online. So it's got all, you know, local news and national news. But the thing that's been making me excited is this is back, the community calendar. So we haven't had a lot of stuff going on, and there's a ton of stuff going on now for Native people and non-Native people. So, you know, you could go to a language table here multiple times during the week, where it's just you have a dish and you speak language. It's happening all over Minneapolis. You can go to a drum and dance group. You can go to an art gallery opening. There's several on Franklin. You know, just again, book signings. We have a lot of great authors here. And so it's fun to see that. It's like 2 pages worth of stuff. And so I always tell people that's a good resource to get to know what's happening in Indian country, because we're an invisible population in Minneapolis. A lot of people think Native people are in the past, or they're not, still live in teepees, or just not alive. And we're all over. There's a lot of things going on. You know, it's making the invisible visible, so people know what's going on. Another thing that I brought some books too, because I always think that I'm a big reader, and I think that that's a great way to learn, because it's not always fun to read like a textbook. Who wants to do that? You know, I'm sorry, Tina, but no. I mean, you know, it's just a way to learn about in both fiction, memoir. So the books, and I swear I'm not working for Louise Erdrich, even though I talk about it a lot, but it's really a treasure that we have by Kenwood School in South Minneapolis, and many of you have been here. It's Birch Bark Books. It's her bookstore, and she is a prolific author, and her books, though, are based on history. So this is her, and I was looking at it, I'm like, I must have been reading this in the bathtub because it's a little wrinkly, but which I usually don't for my hardcover books. But anyway, this is the one. She won the Pulitzer Prize for this. She since has another book out, The Sentence. But this is based on her family history with her tribe. So she's Turtle Mountain Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe, Chippewa, from in North Dakota, and they're a really small community. She's also German, so I was like related to her because, and her name was Louise, but you know. But they tried to terminate her tribe. So that was a thing, tribal termination. It could still happen. It's still something that can happen. And her grandfather went to Washington, and actually, I don't want to ruin the story, but obviously he prevented it. So their tribe is still in existence. And this is a fictional account of that happening, and it's really good, and it's ghosts in here, it's funny. So it's a way to learn about that part of our history, but in an interesting and engaging way. The Night Watchman. Louise Erdrich. Erdrich? Oops. Louise Erdrich.
I grew up 3 miles from the Turtle Mountain.
Oh, did you? Yeah, it's a beautiful,
My
tiny.
had contracts all over the reservation.
Okay.
Stone Creek,
Wow.
and so we were there all the time.
Wow. Her family are Gurnos. Her parents were doctors, and she's, really amazing family. I mean, her sister is Heide Erdrich, who is an amazing poet and also has a cookbook. They're just a really talented people. And she lives right there by the bookstore.
She also put out a couple children's books that I worked on in Turtle Range,
Oh, great.
and then she did Grandmother's Vision,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit about her Turtle Mountain roots of growing up. They just came out a year ago.
Yeah. She has a birch bark house. I don't know where she has the time to get all that writing done, and it's all so good. Yeah. It's worth going to her bookstore again. I don't work for her, but it's a beautiful place and it's got good writing. Another author that I recommend that I think is Diane Wilson. So this is her first book, and it's a memoir, and it was a Minneapolis Book Club book. It's been around for a while. It's called Spirit Car. It's her journey learning about her Dakota past, because she is Swedish and Dakota. And so and I know her personally, we sing together in a group. She's really amazing, and she ran Dream of Wild Health. She wrote this book, then she wrote a book, Beloved Child, about the Dakota worldview with children, and children as sacred beings. And then she just came out with The Seed Keeper. You might have heard of that one. That one won the Minnesota Book Award. And that's her first fiction book, but again, it talks about how women were seed savers, and in particular, like when women were force marched up to Fort Snelling. They sowed seeds in their skirts and wherever they could to be able to feed their family, to save these seeds. I mean, I still get kind of chills when you think about it. And it's an amazing story based on fact and what people did, but in a fiction book so you can be engaged, so it's not like you feel like, oh, I'm studying, I have to learn something. You learn something that way. So it's pretty amazing, but that book was pretty recent and award-winning. And I mentioned Anton Truer before. He's a Leech Lake member. He's actually known for his language work. This is an older book too, but it's really funny, and I like it. It's everything you wanted to know about Indians, but were afraid to ask. So it's funny. And again, here, what is Indian time? That's where I read that. What's a res car? You know, so you'll laugh out loud, and it answers questions. And again, it's a little bit, it's a little bit older, but it's a good resource. You could get this one at Birch Bark Books. You can get this at a lot of bookstores. But there's just so many amazing authors out there. Marcy Rendon, she's an Anishinaabe woman. She's coming out with her third book of nonfiction that's set in the Red River Valley, and they're kind of thrillers. Anyway, so. And this is a great way to learn about Native people, is through books, the fiction and the nonfiction by Native authors in particular.
How big is the school? How many students? And the Department of Indian Works, is it a state or federal program? Or
So
where's the funding? Can you rephrase?
okay, and I didn't know what time it is, if it's, what? Okay, so it's about, we can do more questions too, but so Bedote Learning Center. The Anishinaabe Academy is the American Indian Magnet School for Minneapolis Public Schools. Bedote Learning Center is a charter school, so it's still a public school. It's got about 100 kids. It's very, very small. And it's a challenge, because, immersion learning is a commitment from parents, because you have to, and these are parents that probably don't speak the language. So you have to work extra hard, to get that homework done, to have that language. But people drive their kids from all over for that school because they want that. So Minneapolis Public School does do some immersion, like in pre-K and K. And immersion learning is good for all kids. Like I've in the course of starting the school, like learning about how immersion learning and learning in that language, it impacts your brain as a learner. And it's a real loss, I think, in America, that we don't have kids learning languages like that right away. Our kids are not bilingual. It helps them in all their learning aspects, and but the school's small, and it's always a tough row to hoe when you have a small charter school, because it's a numbers game, because you get a per pupil amount. That's how you pay for your teachers. And so, and if you need 2 teachers, one in each language. So the parents pick their path. So the kids are not learning both language. They're going to be either in the Dakota path or the Anishinaabe path. And it's K-8 right now. And it would be great to have at high school, but that's even more complicated, because in like elementary, you have like 1 teacher often. And you think of all high school, you have all your different subject areas, and you have to have those in the language. So as we're trying to grow the school, we're trying to grow language speakers too. And there's a huge amount of interest. But, in innovation, like several years ago, an Anishinaabe professor, Dr. Sally Hunter, had at St. Thomas, they did a whole cohort where they recruited people that already had their bachelor's who wanted to become immersion teachers. And they paid for them. I mean, those people worked really hard. Most of them were non-traditional learners. They already had families. They were working. But they did get free tuition. They graduated with masters. And most of them were indigenous speakers, either Dakota or Anishinaabe. But there might have been a Hmong graduate, but then they could go on and be licensed teachers. The challenge for a lot of folks is what we've done in the past, or for us as Native communities, is we'll bring elders into the classroom to teach, and that's not always worked out very well because A, they're older, and B, they don't have the teaching training. So you're just putting them in there with a bunch of kindergartners, and that's not fair to either one. And they shouldn't, so the best model is to have a lead with a teacher that has that teaching skills, bringing in that elder with that elder knowledge that goes beyond the language. Then they don't have to chase the kids around or whatever. They can be in the classroom and help with that. But that's expensive. It's expensive. So the school's about, I want to say, is it 5 years old now, 6 years old? And is in it's St. Albert's. I was trying to think. St. Albert the Great, which is a small Catholic school. So a lot of charter schools are in these schools that are attached to churches that used to have schools, which that can be a challenge for Native people because we have our history with boarding schools, right? Like for several generations, our people were forced into boarding schools where there was a lot of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and verbal abuse. And then they, weren't expected to ever really go home. And when they went home, they didn't know how to function in a family. We're still dealing with that. And a lot of those schools were run by churches. So when we opened that school, there were some elders that were like, "Oh, I'm not comfortable here." And the thing is, we at least are talking about that now because people never talked about it. They never talked about what happened. And I am an example of that. I did not know my grandma was in boarding school till I went to her funeral. And my cousin was giving the speech. Well, she never told me. I never knew to ask her. Why would she tell me? It was, why would she talk about that? That's a lot of reason why older people would not speak language to their kids because they didn't want them to suffer. They were protecting their children, protecting their grandchildren. But we have, so again, to my theme that I don't want to, talk about, we know what to do. Language revitalization, cultural revitalization, people want it. And there's a social worker, Dr. Martin Brokenleg, that I admire so much. Tina's heard me talk about him. He's retired now. But I never forgot, he said, in America, we do not teach people about culture. We just don't. It's a melting pot. And he says, nobody wants that, though. Nobody wants to not know where they fit in or belong or their people. And so people will seek it out. And I've heard similar, that's what's attractive to gang culture. That's what's attracted to people want to fit in that area. They don't want to not know. People want to know, and they want to be in a group. Yes?
How many people identify as being Native American
Well, I was looking that up. So she was asking how many people identify as Native American in the state of Minnesota. And I think officially enrolled, we might have 60,000, but more if you talk about unenrolled people. So that's a sensitive issue and one that we're grappling with is, there's only 3 things that that you look at their membership by how much of their blood they have, and that's dogs, horses, and Indians. So there's something wrong with that, and you can guess what I feel about that. Because so we're going to blood quorum ourselves out of existence, right? If we're going to say how many, are you half, are you a quarter? We're really, especially in the urban areas, we're intermarried. But you know where you're from. Very rarely do people say, well, you have to be a certain amount to claim you're Swedish or you're Norwegian or, if you're living in your practice and you know where your family's from and you're part of your family. But it's a touchy issue because sometimes it can be a fight for resources. you know, some of the tribes are really small. Some of the tribes are making a lot of money on gaming too. Most tribes are not making money hand over fist in gaming. That's something I want to be sure to say, because I always get that question. And why do you need to get grants? Why do you need support at DIW? I don't get any casino money. Most of the tribes don't have money like that to give. They're socking it right back into the reservation, into schools, into teaching the jobs. Those that are making a lot of money, like Shakopee, is very wealthy. They're very generous. They helped build my building at DIW. They just gave us money to replace our elevator that's like 30 years old. You know, they are generous, but it's not their job to solve the problems in Indian country. There's a government responsibility to Native people. And so but that's a problem for people. And I know people that are all Native, but they can't enroll in either one of their tribes because their parents are different. Or people that don't have their birth certificate. So recently, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, that coalition I mentioned, voted to do away with blood quorum. But they're letting each tribe has to decide how they're going to do it. So a lot of tribes just do descendancy, which is what everybody else does. And Red Lake just did something, I'm not exactly sure what they did. I think they enrolled everybody that was born in 1952 or earlier. I'm not quite sure what they did. But they started. So I'm waiting to see what they'll do for White Earth. As White Earth commissioned a study from Wilder several years ago, Wilder Research, that it's like, in the future, we will blood quorum ourselves out of existence. And especially in the urban area. So I'm excited to see that. And that really, it's a lot of the urban Native people were voting to support that.
Can you, repeat the question?
Oh, okay.
And then the people on live stream, if they have questions, they can just put it in chat.
Okay.
And then we'll get it, and we'll give it to you.
Okay. Okay. And then you had another question about Division of Indian Work? No, we're a nonprofit. So so the question was, is Division of Indian Work a government program? And we're a nonprofit. So we get funding from the government, though. We get a lot of funding. We get funding from federal government, state, county, city. It's like a giant puzzle. It's very confusing for me when I got the job. Like, who's paying for what here? So that's why we see things come and go. Grant funding comes and goes. We have private donations. We get support from religious and faith communities. We get individual donor support, just a little bit, some tribal support. So it's like a hodgepodge. It's always a puzzle every year. We're doing budgeting right now. And that's a challenge too, is like long-term investment to solve a long-term problem is what we need to see. And what we often see is a grant cycle that's 5 to 10 years. We need a little bit long, especially when we have something that's successful. And we see that works. Like for years, I had funding from the Department of Education, the State Department of Education, and we had this program called Smart Nations. It's the only after-school program at Anishinaabe Academy. We had 50 kids in there. They did better in school. They loved it. It was extremely popular, and this was funded for 2 cycles, and then we didn't get funded. And I think that at that cycle, the only other Indian organization they funded was Red Lake. So sometimes we have the feeling that it's like check off the Indian box. But if you saw on that map, great for Red Lake, but Red Lake's, it's 6 or 7 hours away from here. And so that's something that is my job and the job of the urban Native people to really don't let people forget that you're not serving Native people if you're just giving it to one tribal nation in Minnesota. And we've actually been meeting with the commissioners prior to COVID, and by we, I mean the Metropolitan Urban Indian Directors Group, to ask to see weighted funding. So if you are a Native organization serving a Native community, you should get weighted funding for this. You should get it's a competition, it's competitive. If we want to really eliminate these disparities, don't just fund one. It's often in the group, we're going to fund more than one, and fund it for a while. Especially, no one's asking for people to fund something that's not working, but when we know things that work, like I mentioned doulas, that program is ending with the state next year. Sorry, I'm thinking, I hope I'm not ruining this, but so it's a game. It's always none of us nonprofits, none of the Native nonprofits have an endowment. So we don't have if it's done funded, it's done. If I don't have a grant or a contract, it's hard to keep it going without that. So funders will ask me, what'll happen when the grant's over? I'm like, program will probably be over unless we can get another funder. So we're always out there, always writing the applications, and it's just a treadmill. But I mean, on the other hand, what I think is exciting that we see is we do see funding for cultural work. We have funding that allows us to hire consultants that can come in and teach things to the kids, language, cultural activities, drum, cooking. We never saw, it's more and more we're acknowledging how that it engages people, it keeps people coming, and it shows results. So when you can engage kids, you'll have kids go to school more. They'll graduate at higher levels. So one thing I just want to mention too is, the group that I'm at, and I co-authored the letter that about Steve Svigum, Regent Svigum, who targeted our kids at Morris, because Morris is a University of Minnesota campus. It's a land-grant institution. It's one of the places where students can get free tuition. But I want to say, a lot of people talk about all the Indians get free tuition only if they're enrolled, and a lot of people aren't enrolled, so they're not getting a handout for school. But even if Morris should be giving free tuition, it used to be a boarding school. Just one little way to do reparations could be, but so we had a regent for University of Minnesota actually come out and say that kids are not going to Morris because of our kids. And that's just, unacceptable. My niece is there right now, and I picture her and I'm like, oh, she's being told that she's the reason why enrollment is declining at Morris. That is wrong. That is just wrong. Did he resign all the way, or just as, yeah. I think, yeah, we'll see. Pardon? Yeah, he's still a regent, and that's embarrassing. I think that's embarrassing for the University of Minnesota and the other regents. I hope they're pressuring him. And he went to St. Olaf, so did I. So I'm like, I'm not saying, I'm not about cancel culture, but there are consequences when you say that. And to kind of glibly say, oh, I'm just asking the question. No, I see my niece's face, who's been loving her experience at Morris, how hurtful that is to say that about her. Because it's not just a nameless, faceless. And Morris was having a high population of Native kids. It just had to be the Native people, it had to be like, and it's still not even majority Native, it's majority white. And I just don't think that kids think that way anyway. And people don't want that. Like, every job is looking for diversity. Like, we're strong when we're diverse. We're strong when everybody does well. Like Wellstone's quote, we all do better when we all do better. That's so true. So, I don't know. So I'm digressing off that. So other questions? Okay, so if anybody from home has any questions, you can type it into the chat, and then it'll be shared with me. Do it now.
Are there many indigenous farmers in the state?
So the question is, are there many indigenous farmers in the state? I'm not sure about that answer. I know that there's the Dream of Wild Health is a huge, that farm I mentioned in Hugo. And then there's also different farmers in urban areas. There's several different indigenous farms, farmers, but not with a big farm.
More on the reservations, like even White Earth where you are, there's large farms on that, or not necessarily?
Well, I don't know how many are natives, but I will say that, when you then look at reservations, 90% or more reservations are not even native owned. So they have farmers there, but they're not native farmers. So another thing that happened, Native people, was the Dawes Act and the idea that, again, to solve the Indian problem, let's allot land to individual people. And again, I'm not an expert on this at all, but you could go to Minnesota or Indian Land Tenure website and you can look at all the reservations, and they call it checkerboarding. So that act took the land out of communal tribal trust and gave it to people who then sold it or were tricked out of it. They had to, or they were fooled out of it. The only tribe that didn't do that is Red Lake. So we always tease the Red Lake people like they're special, but they did not allot their land, and it's still tribally owned. But so there's, probably not a lot of farmers that's not Native owned. So that's where some people were mentioning Winona LaDuke. She has a White Earth Land Recovery Project, buying back the land. Shakopee is buying back a lot of their land. But the fact remains is that, reservations and communities were not land that was given to Native people. It's land we managed to retain, and then a lot of that isn't even Native owned. So that's an interesting website to go to, and you can really see the visual of what those reservations look like.
Say the website one more time.
Indian Land Tenure, and so you can go to that. If you go to www.pieducators.com, that's phillipsindianeducators.com, that is really a tremendous resource with links you can go to. There's a really good link called Bedote Memory Map, and it has language resources, and it talks about all the place names here. So we talk about Minnesota or Minnesota, that's Dakota. Minne is water, and depending how you say it, Sota or Shota, like cloud on the water or reflection on the water. Minneapolis, Water City. Minnetonka, Big Lake, a lot of Dakota names. And then, of course, we have Medemokaska, which was really a controversy. I don't know why that was so difficult to go back to, Lake Calhoun had a Native name, and they had a settlement there, a Native settlement. But there was a lot of pushback. And I grew up by Lake Calhoun. I'm like, I don't see what the problem is. It's named after someone with absolutely no ties to Minneapolis, who was an architect of the Indian Removal Act. We can call it what it used to be called, which is Medemokaska. We know what it was called. So those kind of name changes, you can kind of see that happening. They just renamed Ramsey Junior High by my house after Alan Page. Yay, Justice Alan Page. Because Ramsey, again, he was for terminating Indian people. There's a lot of that hurt in those names, or people actually advocating, we should kill all the Indian people. I think it was Ramsey that said that. Don't quote me on that, but and someone might know here that I can't recall, but that the only solution to the Indian problem is to get rid of the Indian people. But people are kind of taking those names back. Yes.
At your food shelf, do you take venison or wild game, ducks?
That's a great question. So the question was, do we take venison or people that are hunting meat? It has to be processed through a meat processing place. So if a hunter takes it and does that, we can take it, but we can't just take someone bringing it because of the health department rules. Because people will call, and we can sign up and get on a venison list. They once at Dream of Wild Health, someone hit a deer and killed it, and so they took advantage of that animal, gave its life. They took it and they showed the kids how to butcher it or whatever, and the kids were just horrified. I mean, these are city kids too. They just were like, oh my gosh, but that is how, they'd never seen that, So yeah, it has to be processed through a company or a plant or whatever. So thanks. And we try to give out the bison, the venison, wild rice, all those things that are harder to come by and expensive. And wild rice, can be very expensive. So everyone's always talking this time of year, was it a good year? Was it a bad year? Was there a lot of water, not enough water? so sensitive, and it's so labor intensive. If you've ever seen how people harvest wild rice and then how they hand part, it's very labor intensive, so it's worth every penny. But and we'll take kids up there. Like, that's a field trip that like we would take or people would take. In Sugar Bush, we can take kids to Sugar Bush, so that's maple syruping. And there's even a native teacher at South High, Minneapolis, that was tapping the maple trees out in Minneapolis by the school. And he kind of got called out on it, but he pushed back. He's tapping the trees, why not? That's a labor-intensive process too. So there's just a lot of, we're making cradle boards at DIW. So we had someone come in and make traditional cradle boards for people. It's what you put the baby in. And so people they want to know how to make them. They want to know how to use them. So we can bring in people to show them how to do it. So it's exciting.
It really helps bring the culture back, doesn't it? To the children when they're seeing.
Yes. Yep, when they're being taught, and then they remember how to do it, and they'll teach other people. So I just see a lot of people asking a lot of time, how do we do that? So we have a sewing circle twice a week at DIW. We're doing quilting, and we're making things like ribbon skirts. These are just kind of fashionable now for a lot of people are wearing them, or ribbon shirts for men, or even regalia. So regalia is what folks wear at powwows. So not to call them outfits, it's regalia. And those are just intensive labors of love. If you've seen some of the incredible beadwork, they're hours and hours of work. Families pass it along, and so some people, especially in our urban areas where we tend to, it's expensive. They don't have that kind of regalia. So we'll make grass dance regalia with them, or help them make a jingle dress, and the accessories that go with it, or learning how to bead, or all those kind of things. So it's also like a good artistic expression, and this could be a job for somebody. Like, there's a lot of thriving clothing companies, jewelry, a lot of places where you can go online and buy a lot of native-made products by native-made designers. So to me, it's like just exposing people to it. How about our musicians, and especially when a lot of our kids in public schools aren't getting that kind of exposure anymore. Like, where's band, where's choir, those things that I remember. I feel like we're missing all this potential for our young artists that could have a career that way and support themselves and have a good life. But they don't know that they're a talented musician. They never got a chance to try it.
That makes me think of a question. So what's one of them, if you were to name 1, 2, 3 things that are misunderstood about Native Americans, is that, you understand?
Yeah, so the top 3 things that I think are misunderstood about Native Americans, that were relics from the past. So it's amazing how many people don't understand, and that there are, Native lawyers and doctors and, all around us, especially in this area. I think another one that I run into all the time is that we're all wealthy from casino money. I get that question almost every time I speak, and not understanding why we can't pull ourselves up from our bootstraps from our casino, our gaming money. Gaming is it's a life changer for a lot of reasons, but and then I think yeah, those are the questions that come up a lot. Or I think that people don't want to practice their traditional ways, or they don't want to walk in that world anymore, and I think that they do. And people do call it walking in 2 worlds, and that's what I see, people, working their jobs. I have a lot of lawyers on my board, a lot of Native lawyers and attorneys and judges, actually. Justice Ann McKeag, who's our Supreme Court, our first Native Supreme Court member, is a member of our board. So walk in that world, but then also want to do their cultural practices. And then I think another thing people don't understand is the racism that still exists, that Native people face day to day. It's not something that I face day to day because I have white privilege, because I look like my mom. And along with that, I would also say there's probably a lot more Native, like what does a Native person look like? Like we look very, like the Native people look like me. They look, what's the stereotypical view of Native is not the way that a lot of Native people look anymore. They still do, but I tell teachers when I do training, never think you don't have a Native person in your classroom. You can't just look and say that person's Native anymore. Or not, and some people are very traditional and follow that traditional with longer hair for men, but some do not. So to say that, it's like we're very, like I said, there's that misconception, I think, and so it's hard for me sometimes because people coming out that are not Native, that have been claiming Native, and getting the privilege from Native, that hurts. All the multiracial people that actually are. So, but I'm kind of losing my train of thought on that one, but that's what I think, yeah, and I just want to emphasize, there still is a lot of racism, like we say with Regent Svigum, and a lot of misunderstanding with Native people about, and mostly negative stereotypes. So one thing that our group does, the MUD group, and that I try to do is like, let's promote and celebrate the good things that are going on in Indian country. And we actually have at DIW boards, we call it the Ho-Wah board, because sometimes when you get excited or something, you go, Ho-Wah, like this is great. So we'll put up, like here is Joy Harjo's coming to do a poetry reading. She's got a new book coming, yeah. Marcy Rendon's book is coming out. Or we just, Sarah Wheelock is the first Native person on the Minnesota Court of Appeals. She has her investiture on Friday. So let's put the good news up there because we don't want to just see the bad news, and it's poverty porn, and that tends to happen. Like we'll see, so the Star Tribune just did a story, and we were going to write a letter, but then we got distracted. But the MUD group, because apparently some like New York Times or somebody criticized Minneapolis as like boring or not good. So they went out and did this story of night in Minneapolis, and they published this, and they went all over Minneapolis and said all these great things, and then the one Native people they have on there, they go to an encampment, and they interview two people that are like, we love fentanyl more than each other. I'm like, that's the only Native people you can find and feature in the Star Tribune is those two people. And no, I know who they are, and it's not to disrespect them, but that's who you're gonna. You can't go to like Quaystrong where we have women's triathlon every fall where women are canoeing, biking, hundreds of Indian women around around Mademacaska. Can't go there, but we're gonna do this. And I'm not saying that there's a lot of good reporters out there and ones that are doing that, but that, things that are shocking sell. So it's like, oh, it's so terrible. So I've tried to promote that and try to if people that I know in the media, like a Reg Chapman at WCCO, he's really supportive. What's going on in Indian country? That's good, because there's a lot going on. Let's not highlight, or just seem to put that out there. So, but it's a line that I walk every day as a director. I want support. I need funding for programming, and we need it as a community. But like I mentioned, I don't want us to think about always negative when we think about Native people, because we have a thriving community in Minneapolis where a lot of good things are happening. Yes?
When I went to elementary and high school, public schools, we were taught little, if anything, about American Indians, Native Americans. Has that changed? Are there education about American Indians, Native Americans in public schools today?
Yeah, I think so. The question was, when people remember, and I remember the same thing, 'cause I'm a graduate of Minneapolis Public Schools, is not being taught a lot about Native people in our history. That's definitely true. It's definitely gotten better through the efforts of, I'd say, a lot of Native educators. So coming up in Minneapolis Public Schools, the whole week before the week of Thanksgiving is Native American Family Involvement Week. And so every school in MPS is supposed to do something. But we're trying to even go further than that, or the Native educators, and you shouldn't just be talking about Natives when it's November around Thanksgiving or May when it's Indian month. When you're talking about Native leaders, leaders and presidents, talk about Native leaders, past and present, because sometimes we just go on the past. I still see that a lot in schools that we're talking about, Native leaders like Sitting Bull, and that's great, but why don't we talk about Winona LaDuke? Why don't we talk about Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan, Deb Haaland? Like, let's not forget that. So I think it's getting better, and I think, and more teachers are aware and teaching about history, and it's tough. So how do you teach about boarding school? And it's not about shame or blame, and then also without re-traumatizing children. But you can get material for all age group on boarding school. It's from Canada, but they have even little books for little kids, like picture books that, you know, a stranger at home from like when, to talk about that. So you can teach people, so you have knowledge about what happened, so we can change things. It has gotten better, it's gotten a lot better. I think when I was in Minneapolis Public Schools, the Indian education was just pull out, so I'd pull out a class and I would meet with an elder once in a while. But nothing like now, where you can actually even, you know, you can go to school with like a magnet school. But across the board, we're doing better. We have a ways to go. Like Canada's talking about their boarding school issues a lot more than what we talk about. And what they found in Canada is what we're gonna find here too.
You know about the bison herd at Red Lake?
No. So it was a question about the bison herd at Red Lake? I don't know. I mean, a lot of the tribes are bringing the bison back, but I don't know. I don't know what's going on.
Well, I heard a program on public radio. When I was doing dishes, I do the dishes sometimes. They were interviewing this woman from Red Lake. And they started a bison herd. They started with 7, and they got more and more. I think they got 16 from Yellowstone National Park.
Wow.
And now they're up to like 100.
Wow. Wow, that's great.
And they were asking, have you, slaughtered, or they call it harvest?
Yeah, harvesting, yeah.
Yet. And they said, no, because the oldest one is the bull.
Oh, they can't do, yeah.
But the plan is to have produce meat and have it in the schools there.
Yeah, I know there's a herd down in southern Minnesota. That teacher I mentioned from South has taken kids there, and he has done harvested one. So yeah, I hear about that more and more happening. And then, you know, that Indigenous Food Network I mentioned earlier, the goal, one of their goals, that we haven't made it there yet, is to have like an Indigenous nutrition center. So like now, you know, you go and get your lunches for public schools at the nutrition center in Minneapolis on the north side. And you know, they're getting better, they're getting healthier, but that's processed food that's packaged in a package in a package. And they're getting better. But we would love to have like a nutrition center with native indigenous food. And I think that'll happen. And so yeah, there's definitely a place. We actually, where we, DIW, get a lot of our bison from is Eichton's. You know, Eichton's up in, it's not a native place, but it's up in, like out in Forest Lake area. Anyway, they have a really good store too. You can get like chili and you can get burgers. So we get a lot of our meat from Eichton's, but it would be nice if we could get our meat from a native. And businesses are developing, like Red Lake has a fishery, so you can get a lot of walleye from Red Lake. So we stock up on that with, you know, people like that. So people are developing businesses that way with those foods that people like. So yeah, well, good for Red Lake. Oh, okay.
I just want to be conscious of people's time. It is 8:30. This has been an incredible night. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh.
I hear a lot of hope in your community, and thank you for sharing it with us. If anyone is interested in learning more about what they can do to volunteer, we can get that information. If you want to leave your, I think there's a form at the back that you can leave your email. And if you're interested in coming to more justice events, that would be great too. You can put your email in the back. And also, if you're on live stream, you can just put it in the chat line, and we'll
Well, miigwech, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.